We are discussing today the Poway shooting. This was at a Chabad Synagogue close to San Diego. And when a place of worship that should be truly sacred, in medieval times it was considered the house of God, a place of refuge for the weary of persecution. It's not even safe anymore to go pray with your fellow co-religionists. It's been 80 years since Kristallnacht happened. This is the Night of Broken Glass. It's a pogrom in November where Jews were attacked by paramilitary forces and civilians in Nazi Germany, and the German authorities looked without intervening. So I know there's a lot of debate of what should the government do to stop these shootings, but this is religious persecution at its best, and it's just seen as another crazy guy hurting people. When the shooter did this, there was an interesting article in the Washington Post, and I'll read it to you guys. It's in the religion section, and this is what prompted me to have the following show. It's by Julie Sosmer. It was on May 1st, 2019. The title is called "The Alleged Synagogue Shooter Was a Churchgoer Who Taught Christian Theology, Raising Tough Questions for Evangelical Pastors." Quote, "Before he allegedly walked into a synagogue in Poway, California, and opened fire, John Ernest appears to have written a 7-page letter spelling out his core beliefs. That Jewish people, guilty in his view of faults ranging from killing Jesus to controlling the media, deserve to die. That his intention to kill Jews would glorify God." Days later, the Reverend Micah Edmondson read those words and was stunned. Quote, "It certainly calls for a good amount of soul searching," end quote. Said Edmondson, a pastor in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, a small evangelical denomination founded to counter liberalism and mainline Protestantism. Ernest, a 19-year-old, was a member of the OPC congregation. His father was an elder, he attended regularly, and in the manifesto, the writer spewed not only invective against Jews and racial minorities, but also cogent Christian theology. So the pastor read those 7 pages trying to understand, quote, "We can pretend as though we didn't have some responsibility for him. He was radicalized into white nationalism from within the very midst of our church," end quote, Emerson said. Ernest's actions on Saturday in Poway where he allegedly killed one Jewish worshiper and injured a rabbi, a child, and another synagogue goer, have spurred debate among evangelical pastors about the role of a certain stream of Christian theology in shaping the young man's worldview, which allegedly turned deadly on the last day of the Passover holiday. Christian leaders across denominations condemned the attack, saying violence against others and white supremacy are completely antithetical to Christian beliefs. Quote, "Anti-Semitism and racist hatred, which apparently motivated the shooter, have no place within our system of doctrine," the OPC denomination said in a statement. But while some said Ernest's background in the church has nothing to do with his alleged crime and the church shouldn't have to answer for him, others called for a moment of reckoning. Some drew comparisons to Muslim communities asked to account for terrorist attacks and worried that they could be in the same position when the shooter claims to be a faithful Christian. Quote, "When there's an act of radical Islamic terror, somebody claiming they are motivated by their Islamic faith, if they were going to call upon moderates in Muslim communities to condemn those things, we should do the same. I wholeheartedly full stop condemn white nationalism," end quote, said Chad Wolf, an evangelical pastor in Fort Myers, Florida, who was one of the first to join in a heated debate online about how the attack reflects on evangelicalism. Quote, "We should recognize that somebody could grow up in an evangelical church whose father was a leader and could somehow conflate the teachings of Christianity and white nationalism. We should be very concerned about that," end quote. At the church where Ernest belongs, Escondido Orthodox Presbyterian Church in the San Diego suburbs, members expressed shock and horror at the action allegedly committed by one of their own. The pastors hosted a discussion the day after the attack after the Sunday service and vowed to see how he could support the grieving synagogue nearby. Ernest's family, which includes 5 siblings, published a statement saying their son's beliefs do not match their faith and horrified them. In the manifesto, the writer said that he did not learn his white supremacist belief from his family. The manifesto, which circulated online after the attack and before numerous mainstream social media websites attempted to remove it, reeled-off grievances against Jewish people, many of which had little to do with religion. But the writer also spoke of biblical justification and of Christian belief throughout the document. The main themes were Jews' guilt in the biblical narrative and his own salvation. Several pastors said they found the manifesto's parts about salvation significantly more troubling, because when it came to what it said about salvation, they agreed with it. So as we can see, there's a debate now among these traditionalist Christians. If you read the manifesto, it's just horrendous and ridiculous, the kind of stuff that he brings up. I am going to share it with our audience just so you know where these things are coming from. It seems Mel Gibson and Hitler would be very proud of him. I decided to get a hold of my colleague and acquaintance, Dr. Michael Heiser, who is part of that reformist church. He's also an evangelical. I guess you can be both. And he's a leader within his circles. It just seems that he would be a good guest. We've talked about anti-Semitism on his show. Ernest wrote this an open letter. Quote, "My name is John Ernest, and I'm a man of European ancestry. The blood that runs in my veins is the same that ran through the English, Nordic, and Irish men of old. I'm a descendant of one of the original colonists of the Roanoke, John Ernest. What happened to him I do not know, nor does anyone. But I do know that he left his wife and son, James Ernest, back in England. This son shortly after made the same daring journey across the Atlantic to the New World. From my mother's side, I inherited the blood of very wealthy Yankees, intelligent, resourceful, uncompromising. From my father's side, I inherited the blood of poor southern farmers, intelligent, musically gifted, self-sufficient. A part of my ancestors lives within me in this very moment. They are the reason that I am who I am. Their acts of bravery, ingenuity, and righteousness live on through me. Truly, I am blessed by God for such a magnificent bloodline." We're reading the manifesto of John Ernest, the shooter of the Poway Chabad Synagogue near San Diego. The reason that we're reading this is because we're doing a show on his background and how he used religion to justify his attack. We're going to start up the second part of what was available online for his manifesto. Starts off like this, quote, "How does killing Jews help in the European race? The European race is doomed. What are you talking about? These Jews were innocent. Every Jew is responsible for the meticulous planned genocide of the European race. They act as a unit, and every Jew plays his part to enslave the other races around him, whether consciously or subconsciously. Their crimes are endless, for lying and deceiving the public through their exorbitant role in the news media, for using usury and banks to enslave nations in debt and control all finances for the purposes of funding evil, for their role in starting wars on a foundation of lies which have costed millions of lives throughout history, for their role in cultural Marxism and communism, for pushing degenerate propaganda in the forms of entertainment, for the role in feminism which has enslaved women in sin, for causing many to fall into the sin within their role in peddling pornography, for the role in voting for and funding politicians and organizations who use mass immigration to displace the European race, for their large role in every slave trade for the past 2,000 years, for promoting race mixing, for their cruel and bloody history of genocidal behavior, for their persecution of Christians of old, including the prophets of ancient Israel, Jeremiah, Isaiah, etc., members of the early church, Stephen, whose death at the hands of the Jews was both heart-wrenching and rage-inducing, Christians of modern-day Syria and Palestine, and Christians in white nations for their degenerate and abominable practices of sexual perversion and blood libel. You're not forgotten, Simon of Trent. The horror that you and your countless children have endured at the hands of the Jews will never be forgiven. For not speaking about these crimes, for not attempting to stop the members of their race from committing them, and finally for the role in the murder of the Son of Man, that is the Christ. Every Jew, young and old, has contributed to these. For these crimes they deserve nothing but hell. I will send them there." End quote. I don't mean to make fun of him. The voice that I was using was kind of like the voice that you would think of someone who's malicious and wickedly inspired to write such filth. And in the past, I've used different voices to quote anti-Semites throughout history when I did a reading of a book that talked about persecution of Jews. So it's just for dramatic effect. But as you can see, it's it's just the rambling of a lunatic. No, this is like very methodical. Why? Because if you read any anti-Semitic blog or conspiracy theory online, it's the same old stuff. And he's surprised and he's complaining about what happened to supposedly a Catholic child, that it is a conspiracy and there's no proof of it, from the 1400s. So they're piggybacking on paranoia. Have you guys heard of the satanic ritual paranoia of the 1980s? That stuff was happening all the time in medieval Europe, and now these people who supposedly care about history are bringing up stuff that nobody even knows about and trying to pin it on modern people that had nothing to do with it. And they have been persecuted 80 years ago for similar slanderous accusations. So it's just sickening. And what I don't understand, and this is why I contacted Dr. Heiser. He's a theologian, he's a speaker. It's like, how can people with those type of mentalities be members and involved in the local churches, down the street? So I brought all these issues up to Dr. Heiser, and I want to see what you guys think about this. So if you'd like to contact us, mysticandskeptic@gmail.com, and let us know how I don't even know how people. What's the reaction that I expect? A certain reaction from the leaders of these communities. But so this is what I presented to Dr. Heiser, and this is how he responded. Again, we're talking about the Poway, California shooting at a Chabad Synagogue, and our guest is Dr. Michael Heiser. He's a professor of Hebrew, Bible, and Semitic language, a scholar in residence for Logos Bible Software, an author, blogger, and fellow podcaster. We thank him for participating in our show. And our topic, for those who just started listening, is how faith and religious views can affect someone's thinking to go commit a crime. On April 27, 2019, on the Sabbath, an armed young man walked into the Jewish place of worship north of San Diego and opened fire on the congregants, killing an Israeli young lady and injuring the rabbi as he was giving his last day Passover sermon. I got a hold of the suspect's manifesto, which was available on Twitter, and it was captured by someone who got it before the networking site took it down. In the manifesto, the shooter blamed Jews for the supposed meticulous planned genocide of the European race, known as the White Genocide Conspiracy Theory, which has been spread by white nationalists and we have discussed it on the show. He cited shooters Brenton Harris, Tarrant, and Robert Bowers for their roles in the respective shootings of Christchurch Mosque and the Pittsburgh Synagogue shooting, as well as Jesus, Paul the Apostle, Martin Luther, Adolf Hitler, and Ludwig van Beethoven for being the figures who inspired him to commit the Poway shooting. He condemned President Trump as a pro-Zionist traitor. He also justified his actions by including Bible quotes in his manifesto. The quotes and allusions to biblical passages are the most disturbing. So I have Dr. Heiser here to discuss this because before this happened, John Ernest, the 19-year-old, was an active member of the Escondido Orthodox Presbyterian Church, a traditional conservative Christian denomination. If mainstream Jews or Muslims had one of their community members heard others and quote their scriptures to justify all America would demand accountability from these religious institutions. Dr. Heiser, is that the same for a Christian? According to the Washington Post article, the pastors have tried to make sense of this, but I just don't understand. Help me understand why this happened.
I would say that your summary there includes some assumptions that are quite understandable, that the average person, I think, would quite easily make. This 19-year-old steeped in the Christian worldview. He was a member of this church. My first response to that is big deal. In Presbyterian churches, you become a member of the church, when you're baptized as an infant, and then you're confirmed at some point, usually when you hit teenage years or something like that. That doesn't mean you're listening to anything in the church. That means you go through the motions, the community rituals. I've met Jews who were, confirmed, to use a Christian term, but the bar mitzvah and the bat mitzvah. When I was teaching at UW-Madison, for instance, I was honestly shocked by this. But I found myself in a summer one time teaching a room full. It was about 40 or 50, and everybody in there was Jewish, and it was called the Senior Scholars Program. So everybody in there is about, their retirement age. And I did this for 3 summers and loved it. But the first summer I was there, I discovered that the whole, everybody in the classroom was Jewish except for me. And naturally I was doing something Bible related. I had people in that class, and I'm not kidding. I sort of wish I was, but I'm not. But I had people in that classroom ask me who Adam and Eve were. I had people ask me if there are books in their Bible other than the Torah. So that is, I'm going to use that as an analogy. You can't assume anything about what a person really knows. So there's a problem with the assumption there. The second issue is, I don't know anything about this Presbyterian church. If they're Orthodox Presbyterian, they're not teaching that it's a good idea to go kill Jews, and they're not teaching that the Jews, are responsible for everything. There's probably a bunch of supersessionists in there. Believe the church has replaced, Israel as the people of God, and it depends how you define that as to whether it's coherent in terms of what the New Testament is talking about. But I'll tell you where this person got this. He got it from the internet. He got this from where you find it. It's where it's ubiquitous. This is the problem, not just within the Christian community, but it's a problem, really within any community. The days of your parents and your religious leadership being the gatekeepers to not only what is said about their faith or their religion, but basically what is said about anything. The days of you having a small number of gatekeepers that filter the knowledge to the people under their care are over, and they've been over for a number of years. It is a wild, wild west of massive amounts of information, most of it garbage. And the worst of it is going to be the kind that takes touch points, nuggets, in the case of religious stuff, religious texts. And, they have a bunch of data points and dots, and then they connect them for you. And this is how not just religious conspiracies, specifically anti-Semitic conspiracies, do what they do. It's also how alternative worldviews, like the ancient aliens community or the flat Earth community, or fill in the blank, they will look at religious texts or other documents and pull out things that are said and then start just stringing data points together in a bunch of non sequiturs, and there you go. We have a worldview. We have, some philosophy or something like that. So this is a huge problem. Again, I'm not opposed to, free speech or, free public access to information. But young people especially are just imbibing and absorbing just a lot of nonsense on a daily basis. And the people, again, under whose care they might be, could be completely appalled at what's really running through that person's head, but they either never have the conversation because the person doesn't want it, or if the person does initiate a conversation, unfortunately, they get dismissed. They just get told, well, don't read or watch that nonsense. The discussion just doesn't happen. There's no one there to kind of inject some sanity into what's being said. And it ain't going to get any better. I'm sorry for being pessimistic, but my view is that it's not going to get any better because it's just there. You can't put the genie back into the bottle when it comes to this thing we call and start taking this information or the access to the information seriously and saying, look, you're going to run into this. Let's spend some time. And if it has to be in church, fine, but we need to spend some time unpacking this and showing you how really terrible the thinking is and how misguided the thinking is on this, any given subject. So, I don't, again, I don't look at this person's membership, if their affiliation, that basically means nothing to me. I have spent 20 years teaching lots of undergrads. They grew up in church. Oh, they're Christians. They have memberships and things, and they don't know squat. Okay, you can put in a thimble, what they really know about Scripture. They know the culture. They've acclimated to the culture. They know to say the right things, but they just basically don't know a whole lot. And again, I don't know if my experience with the Jewish community in Wisconsin was anomalous, but I was shocked, maybe because they were adults. I was shocked, and I thought maybe with an older generation there would have been something more serious going on. But again, I don't know what was going on in any of their individual synagogues. I mean, I've met plenty of Jewish people that have a really deep knowledge of what their scriptures say. But again, it taught me to just make no assumptions, and then again to map over what I see coming out of churches now, just generally. They're not on a busy week in church stuff, they get maybe an hour a week. Even if you have 2 services, you get 30 minutes a pop. Okay, an hour a week out of 167. If I'm terrible at math, but the number of hours a week that are there, if you spend 1 hour on Bible stuff, you can spend 20 years there. You're not going to learn much. Chances are it's going to be a lot of repetition too, because that's another problem altogether. So the context for this, I think is unfortunately all too normal. But I think where this person is getting the information and the terrible thinking, I think is pretty obvious what the source is. I think that's the internet.
Well, so we've done multiple shows about anti-Semitic ideas and the way that people put together conspiracy theories, but the most shocking aspect of his manifesto was a particular allusion to a verse, and you're famous for giving people context and the tools to be able to think critically about the Bible and be able to interpret things from its original context. So one thing he said that I would like to get the correct interpretation based on it, on your perspective, is he said that the Jews killed the prophets. And then he goes and they kill a bunch of other people. And it seems like he was alluding to Matthew 23:13 37 through 38, and I've been trying to wrap my mind around that.
Well, boy, I could be a bit sarcastic here, but I mean, I want to treat this person seriously. He probably did get it from Matthew. But the question to ask is, where does Matthew get it? And the answer is the Hebrew Bible. I mean, the historical books of the Hebrew Bible are full of what scholars would call the prophetic critique of fellow Jews. Occasions, even other prophets, like Jeremiah 22 and 23. The Hebrew Bible is filled with, if you'll pardon the bit of an anachronistic term here, but it's filled with Jewish leaders being critical of other Jews. It's I don't know. Again, I could be a little sarcastic and say this kid, and maybe he never even heard a sermon on it or had no exposure to it at all. But chances are he probably never read the historical books or had anybody teach him the content of the historical books or the prophets, because that's where Matthew gets this. He's not making this up. Matthew isn't. He's drawing on a track record of violence, of Jews against Jews, and it worked. It could really work both ways. All the way really from the period of the judges all the way, through the divided monarchy. You could have apostate Jews, Jews who were, worshiping other gods or something like that, killing off the prophets. But then you also have, judges, raised up to get rid of the bad guys, like, Jehu or something like that, or one of the judges in the book of Judges. And they do the same thing. So the Old Testament, again, the Hebrew Bible is just filled with this. So to say that this is Matthew, on one hand, yeah, Matthew does allude to this. But the question to ask, again, is the one that few people ask. Where does Matthew get it? The answer is the Hebrew Bible. Now, does that mean that either the Jewish community, would be justified today in dealing with its opponents, with violence? No, because for one thing, we're not a theocracy. For another thing, even some of those actions, sort of skip the ethical component, of how Israelites were supposed to relate to each other, and all this sort of thing. And the same thing goes for the Christian community. We're not a theocracy. The theocracy, as I speak as a Christian now, someone with the New Testament in mind, and the New Testament draws consistently on the Old Testament, including for this thought. But the theocracy was planned by God to be obsolescent. It was planned to go away. How do we know that? We know that from the prophets, because the prophets talk about Gentiles being brought in and becoming priests in Jerusalem, to the Most High. I mean, that was never the end point, the planned end point of what God was going to do. He was going to create this thing that later in the New Testament gets called the church. Okay, he could have called it something else. It just means assembly, community. But it was a circumcision neutral thing. And you will read, in the Hebrew Bible, this vision, especially latter chapters of Isaiah, you'll read about this vision of the community of God being inclusive. So there's really nothing here that's uniquely Christian. There's nothing here that, says, well, we ought to behave like the judges and prophets of old in a theocratic setting. There's no legitimacy for that. But again, I can sit here and say that because I've tracked through this material a lot. But the average person in a church is barely exposed to any of it. But they'll read a verse somewhere, either on their own or in some document on the internet, and then they won't even ask, the most obvious interpretive questions about it. So it's really unfortunate. Again, I tend to be a bit of a pessimist here, that I don't think it's going to get any better, because you can't put the genie of the internet back into the bottle.
So Mr. Heiser has just corroborated one of the concerns I've had. that unsubstantiated accusations against Jews are very common in the Christian world. There's a website called tectonics.org, Tecton Education Apologetics Ministry, which asks the question, did the Jews kill their own prophets? The author actually says that there's a passage in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 14 through 15, where Paul says the following, quote, "For you also have suffered like this of your countrymen, even as they have of the Jews, who both killed the Lord Jesus Christ and their own prophets, and have persecuted us, and they please not God, and are contrary to all men." End quote. He says that this charge made by Paul is virtually unsupported by scriptural evidence. The way to get around it, he says that there are books that were written by prophets that are not that well known, and they were lost to us, and there it talks about how prophets were killed by fellow Jews. The issue with this is that it's just another way of stretching historical truth to fit their theological perspective. One of the most difficult passages is the passage in Matthew 23:37, where Jesus says, quote, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those who sent to you. How often have I longed to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing." End quote. So in this passage, Jesus is making an accusation that is also not easily validated. I'm going to quote the two verses that some people might be talking about from the Hebrew Bible. According to 2 Chronicles chapter 24, verse 20 to 21, this is from the New King James Version. This is one of the passages that Christians use as evidence for both Jesus and Paul being correct about the accusation of Jews killing fellow Jews in the time of the prophets. Quote, "Then the Spirit of God came upon Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, the priest, who stood above the people and said to them, 'Thus says God, why do you transgress the commandments of the Lord, so that you cannot prosper? Because you have forsaken the Lord, he also has forsaken you.' So they conspired against him, and at the command of the king they stoned him with stones in the court of the house of the Lord." End quote. The first passage. Second passage is Jeremiah chapter 26, verse 20 through 23. This is from the New International Version. Quote, "Now Uriah, son of Shemaiah, from Kiriath Jearim, was another man who prophesied in the name of the Lord. He prophesied the same things against the city and this land as Jeremiah did. When the king Jehoiakim and all his officers and officials heard his words, the king was determined to put him to death. But Uriah heard of it and fled in fear to Egypt. King Jehoiakim, however, sent Elnathan, son of Achbor, to Egypt, along with some other men. They brought Uriah out of Egypt and took him to King Jehoiakim, who had him struck down with a sword and his body thrown into the burial place of the common people." End quote. And then there's the passage in Life of Elijah where it talks about many prophets being killed by the Phoenician queen Jezebel. So here we have the passages that are used to justify this hatred of Jews. You can go down the line and create other historical cases, but this is where the idea of Jews killing their own prophets comes from. I don't think it's a fair accusation, but it is a theological one made by Christians and by this individual that we're talking about. We now return to our interview with Dr. Michael Heiser regarding the Poway shooting that happened at a Chabad Synagogue in May, and we're trying to figure out how is it possible that a church member and faithful Christian could have committed such a crime. The issue is this, it happens with the Muslim communities. The Muslim community would say, well, we're not teaching that people should do destructive things. They are taking their writings and interpreting them by themselves. But the question always goes back to, What is
That's a little bit misleading on the part of the Muslim community in this respect. And I know not all Muslims are theocrats. I mean, I follow some on Twitter that I really respect that are trying to be voices of sanity and reason, and like Zudi Jas or somebody like that. It's a little misleading in that the difference is that you do have a significant wing of Islam which is theocratic. They want a caliphate. Okay, so the Quran is not this neutral document that nobody in organized Islam thinks this way. No, actually, a lot of people do. Even if it's 5%. I mean, it's just a numbers game. I'm making these numbers up now, but I'm sure it's more. But if there's 100 million Muslims in the world, I'm sure it's closer to 1 billion. But I'll lowball it. 10% of that is 10 million. Half of that is 5 million. That's a lot of people. It's not quite the same. I don't know any group in Christianity other than the white supremacist group, which again, this is a conspiratorial hermeneutic that really isn't born out of the New Testament. The New Testament is used for ammunition, but I don't know anybody in the organized Christian community that other Christians would say, yes, that's a Christian denomination, that says we should be harming or harming Jews or being anti-Semitic. I mean, there are passages in the New Testament. We could talk about a few of those if you want, but on a denominational level, it's not really the same as what the Muslims have to deal with, because the small percentage is they are theocratic. They do want a caliphate, and if you're a fellow Muslim that disagrees with you, they will kill you. And so there's a serious intimidation factor. Even the Muslims who just want to live their life. They're like anybody else. They're afraid, and it's hard to blame them if they're living in a culture where they don't have certain legal protections or some kind of protection mechanism. It's hard to. It's understandable that they could remain, silent, even if they're a silent majority, and let the theocrats do their thing. So it's not quite the same thing, even though that sort of religious equivalence or cultural equivalence, is often made. It really isn't quite. It's not really the same, and it's that theocratic element.
I feel that we miss each other sometimes when we come from different perspectives. My dialogue with Dr. Heiser started before this conversation that is being played today. We started emailing regarding this because he had a sincere interest in finding out about what this accused shooter had to say or what his manifesto said. So I sent him a copy of it, and he responded in relation to where would someone get these types of ideas. For Christians to say that someone who holds these strong views must be a white nationalist or some type of neo-Nazi, it's interesting because they consider themselves Christians, and if you read the literature of the New Testament, both the Gospels and the letters of Paul, the response from Christians is always like, well, they're Jews themselves, so if they criticize other Jews, that's part of the game of being involved in religious discussions. Dr. Heiser claims that this individual, Ernest, was filtering the New Testament through a 19th century racial theory and the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is a forgery. Some of his ideas come from an author named Paul Haupt, pre-Nazi author from the 19th century, who was an anti-Semitic biblical scholar. So this has been brewing for a long time. This long discussion that I've had with Dr. Heiser always goes back to there's theological differences between Christians and Jews regarding our understanding of the Bible. And the type of fanaticism that leads to this type of hatred and bigotry is the one that starts seeing people as other and hating them for their supposed views, because it's assuming the Jews are as organized as they claim and that they all have similar perspective. And when Christians misunderstand the Jewish community, they create a false narrative that leads them to to these ideas. Christian authors, ministers, missionaries are often ready to attack Judaism with only a surface knowledge of this vast tradition. So we go back to the interview with Dr. Heiser. I'm sorry, Dr. Heiser, but it's not the same now, but it has been the same throughout the centuries, because the same Bible verses that this young man was using have been used by inquisitors, by Catholic fanatics, by Protestant fanatics, by people through the century.
Yeah, and I would use, again, I would use those terms as well. I am one, again, I don't care what label you take. The church at Rome, and again, this isn't a slam on modern Catholics today, but it's a historical reality. The church in Rome, they weren't doing theology. Okay, they weren't doing exegesis of the New Testament and poring over the text and wondering what it says. They somehow would miss things like the Sermon on the Mount. They're doing theocratic politics. The Church of Rome is a political institution, and it was since the 4th century. It's what screwed it up. Jesus never advocated the merging of church and state. In fact, he advocated the exact opposite. But when you merge the church and the state, then the church and its teachings become a political tool, and that's absolutely what happened with Catholicism, and even the Reformation contexts. Calvin's Geneva, Luther's Germany, because they derived from a Catholic context. This is what even in a Protestant Reformation context, you have a lot of this happen, because that's the model that they're used to. They're used to a church-state marriage. Again, this is something Jesus explicitly denied. Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Nowhere did he advocate a church-state. And when you marry those two things, this is what you get is you get medieval Catholicism. You get baptizing political persecution with religion. And to me, that is not New Testament teaching. It's not New Testament Christianity. I don't care what label you stick on it; it isn't. But when you look in in hindsight in history, you're right. There is a lot of it. And it should have been, and it should be now, absolutely condemned, and it should never be repeated. But you can't undo history either. The Catholic Church nowadays isn't running around advocating this, thankfully, at least I guess publicly or whatever. Maybe there's somebody in there that is, but this is what you get. This is what you get when you violate the New Testament teaching. That's what you get. You ignore Jesus' admonition to keep these things separate, and when you don't, it grows into this monster that is horrific and did horrific things.
I have to respond to Dr. Heiser's claim that Jesus never fused state and church. In those times, religion and national sovereignty were always fused together. That's why the Israelites fought against the Romans several times to get them out of their land so they could worship God freely. And they fought the Greeks and other kingdoms for the same reason. So this idea that Jesus was free love hippie who did not have any national aspirations or religious institutions in mind flies in the face of the New Testament, where he talks about governmental institutions such as the temple and going there to cleanse yourself or to show if a miracle happened to the priest. He shows regard towards the leaders of that time by saying that they sit in the seat of Moses. He has stories about people giving taxes to the temple. He also partakes of temple festivities, even though he makes a demarcation between being subject to the Roman Empire. He's always talking about the kingdom of God. And what is the kingdom of God? A theocratic kingdom, just like the one that Moses enacted at Mount Sinai. I don't know where he was going with this, but it seems a little disingenuous to portray Jesus as some type of revolutionary against the state. He was a revolutionary against what he thought to be corrupt leaders, from what we gather from the historical record. But his revolution was not based on violent overthrow. It was meant as changing the hearts and minds of the common folk. But there was always this tension among him and the apostles regarding bringing back theocratic kingdom that every apocalyptic and eschatological group of that time was waiting for. And even the ones that weren't eschatological wanted some type of freedom of worship. The Christians, the Muslims, and the Jews of today are looking back in an idyllic time when either King David, Jesus, some type of Messiah, or descendant Muhammad, or other religious figure can regain what has been lost through the centuries, God being supreme and the people partaking of the worship of God in some type of monarchic political reality. Again, it seems convenient to change Jesus. They even call him a king. What is a king? If he was proclaimed by his followers as the king of the Jews, that means that he's the king of the worshippers of the God of Israel, who are all members of a theocratic state, and he is the religious and political leader of those individuals. And even if the kingdom is a spiritual kingdom, it still holds connotations of there's rules, there's certain covenantal responsibilities from the members, and that is in relation to other kingdoms and other powers in the land of Israel, pre-Roman Palestine, as it was called, after the destruction of the temple and the banning of Jews from Jerusalem and the Holy Land. Well, it happened during Nazi Germany with the churches working with the Nazis. It happened during a lot of different periods in Christian history. But what I'm giving you an opportunity is to help people, because one way to look at someone like this, like he's just crazy, he's gonna look for issues to try to justify his actions. But there is in the study of radicalization, there is a point where a person can turn around, when someone can actually be saved per se from heading in that direction. And I think that's where, they've been working with imams and with, trying to reform supremacists and stuff like that, to say, well, if they would have had a chance to look at it from a different perspective, or to be more faithful to the source or something like that, then the person wouldn't have kept on going and building up their premise for violence. Yeah,
it is kind of interesting. Now, I don't have you read anything just recently, and I can't remember where I saw this. I bookmarked it, but I haven't read it yet. There was something online about sort of testimonies of white supremacists, like what turned them around. Have you read any of that? Because I know, like
I've heard of different stories, but go ahead.
Yeah, I know in the Muslim community, I mean, for those for whom this is totally intentional, I mean, they start them from very young. Almost as soon as they can talk, they're teaching them, radical ideology. And I mean, I've read a few testimonies in the Islamic world, where it was basically relationships, with believers. In some cases, some fairly dramatic things, but I haven't read the same thing for the white supremacist community. I'm just wondering, in your experience, do they tactically do the same thing? Do they start people really young, or is it something along the way?
Well, you're familiar with the Westboro Baptist group, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So they're an example of how, and we can talk politics, but people who are afraid of others, they build up their premise based on, the homosexual community is destroying America, or the Jews, or.
Do you know if Westboro is an anti-Semitic group, or is it just the gay thing with them?
Here, Dr. Heiser sets me up for a failed attempt at explaining how, when you start attacking one group, it's really easy to go down the line and attack everybody else. And people can debate regarding morality and views regarding sexuality, but it's really easy to take an idea and then run with it. So if the Bible condemns some type of behavior, it's easy for people to jump between we don't agree with that, we don't accept that, to these people don't deserve to live. And what I'm asking Dr. Heiser is for Christians to renounce any type of bigotry. Because if you claim that your religion is right, why can't you do it in a loving and a compassionate way and treat people with respect, and then maybe you can change their minds? When it comes down to anti-Semitism, no matter what the Jews do, even if they accept Christianity, they are persecuted and hated for their innate evil. And this is coming straight from the Inquisitors and Nazi Germany, where Jews who had no semblance of Judaism or Jewish life were still persecuted out of this blind hatred. And when it comes down to anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish readings of religious texts, this is where we need to work together to avoid that. If you listen to what is coming on the interview, he discusses theological differences between Jews and Christians, but it's an easy jump from a theological condemnation to a racial condemnation to some type of way to address the elephant in the room that comes from someone not having the right allegiance. And if you talk again about church and state, now you have individuals demanding allegiance to their king and their religious figure. And if you don't do that, then your life is not worth living. So we start this episode of The Mystic and the Skeptic back to the conversation with Dr. Michael Heiser regarding the Poway Synagogue shooting committed by John Ernest. And in the last episode, he asked me, what did I know about the Westboro Baptist Church? It's interesting because they are a very well-known group of provocateurs. He was asking me if they had anti-Semitic hatred just like this young man did. It is documented by the Anti-Defamation League that in some of their articles on their website, such as one published on October 6, 2011, the Westboro Baptist Church describes the Holocaust as God's punishment on the Jews. The founder of, or the leader of the group, says the following on Westboro Baptist Church frequently asks questions, what do you think of the Jews? Quote, the only true Jews are Christians. The rest of the people who claim to be Jews aren't, and they are nothing more than typical impenitent sinners. The vast majority of Jews support, derogatory term for homosexuals. In fact, it is the official policy of Reformed Jews to support same-sex marriage. Of course, there are Jews who still believe God's law, but most of them have even departed from that. It doesn't matter if you're a Jew or Gentile as long as you believe in Christ. End quote. That was November 17, 2006. And then in an article by the Defamation League, they also quote the leader. The article is called Extremism in America's Westboro Baptist Church, in their own words, on Jews, from October 11, 2011. Quote, homosexuals and Jews dominated Nazi Germany. The Jews now wander the earth, despised, smitten with moral and spiritual blindness by a divine judicial stroke. And God has smitten Jews with a certain unique madness. Jews thus perverted out of all proportion for their numbers, energize the militant sodomite agenda. Jews are the real Nazis. End quote. We later discuss how it's theologically acceptable to condemn different groups. But again, I'm trying to get to the point of, can the Christian community make sure to condemn people like them so then there's no confusion? People know that Westboro Baptists, anti-Semitic groups, white nationalists, Ku Klux Klan, and people like that are offshoots, heretical or unfaithful witnesses to the Christian message, and that it's unacceptable to hold those views. It's taken a lot for major Christian denominations to make those statements, and there are some that are now being couched under political rhetoric, some negative views towards Jews. We return to our interview with Dr. Michael Heiser regarding what could cause a devout Christian to hold so much hatred in his heart and hurt other people because they don't believe what he does. And we're talking about the Poway Synagogue Shooter, John Ernest, and this happened in April of this year. Well, some people, like, this is my issue. Like you were saying that the Catholic Church became this monster, but the traditional Catholic Church is actually very consistent with their theology. Their theology teaches that unless you believe a certain way, you are going to hell. And then the people that they see as the enemy are the ones who deny that. So the first ones in line are the Jews, then the pagans, and then everybody else. So in the same way, a Westboro Baptist group.
Right, but there's not an advocacy to send people to hell by killing them. I mean, you can disagree theologically. A Jew, and again, some of the Jews I know would certainly, put the hand up in the air here and say Mike is just completely nuts and he's misguided. I understand that, because of the person of Christ and whatnot. There's a fundamental disagreement there. But they're not looking at me, thinking that I deserve some sort of physical punishment for it. So your question takes an obvious thing that yes, there are diametrically oppositional views here. And in the case of religion, it can be, it doesn't have to be, but it can be this heaven or hell question. Okay, that's true. That's transparently obvious, but your question, the way it was worded, sort of assumes that there's an advocacy element that attaches to it, that we've either got to send the opposition there or they deserve some physical punishment, like we want this to happen to them, and I hope we get to be the ones to do it.
Let me give you an example from history. So my ancestors are Jews from Spain, and the Roman
Oh well, there you go with the Inquisition. I mean, your ancestors would have suffered greatly.
Right. So the Roman Catholic kings said we can't have the Jews around because they're being a bad influence to the Jews who were forcibly converted to Catholicism, and then they created the Inquisition to hunt down heretics who they saw were returning to Judaism. So it was a life or death.
Right. Because and why did they do that? Because they married the church to the state. And so the solution to that is to actually pay attention to and live by New Testament theology, which says you shouldn't marry the church to the state. But again, once you do that, and by the time, that time period, I mean, you've got centuries just built up, accrued to this unbiblical thing. Okay, let's just call it a non-New Testament thing. It does have a life of its own. People don't know any better because the Catholic Church also, forbade the independent study of Scripture, where somebody might find out, hey, we screwed this up. So again, these are all historical realities. That's again certainly obvious, but what they are is they're not New Testament theological realities. They're not something that derives from a careful study of the text. There's something that derives from history, from the notion. And again, I'm not saying it was sinister at the beginning, because Christians were persecuted a lot. Oh, isn't it great that Theodosian, legalized Christianity, made it the official religion? Now we don't have to worry about our kids getting sold into brothels anymore. And I get it. I get it that would have been a good thing, but there were just people who again ignored the admonition of Jesus to keep these things separate and married them. And now we have to live with the results, whether it be a historical perspective or somebody that's imbibing in the same thinking now. It's a terrible thing. But what someone does, in the name of their religion, doesn't have to be an accurate reflection of what, in this case, one of their sacred books would say. What it takes is it takes influence, it takes power. Historically speaking, you got these two things married. If you want to, live, eat, have a job, get married, have kids, and not be living under tyranny, most people are just going to go along with that. And again, when you take the knowledge source away, that you forbid people from actually, reading the scriptures, whether they can, assuming they can read, but, the Bible was on the list of forbidden books, at one point in Catholicism. When you do stuff like that, your interest is not in people learning the New Testament. Okay, your interest is you listen to me, and we're going to maintain power. And this is what you're supposed to believe. And if you don't believe, we're going to excommunicate you, because we've taught another false doctrine, that the church is the dispenser of grace. The church is the one that sends you to heaven. None of this is New Testament. These are all power mechanisms using, again, in this case, the New Testament, to create a political theology. And unfortunately, it worked pretty well, and it's been around for a long time. And this is one of the sort of extreme results. Thankfully, not so much anymore, but still, yes, it does happen. Like with, again, the guy you opened the show with. But it's just awful across the board. It's awful thinking. I would be willing to call it just a slander of the New Testament. I think it's a slander of the Hebrew Bible to use the prophetic, stuff. What's going on during the monarchy and the divided monarchy. I think that would be a slander of the text. That isn't what the text is supposed to tell us to do in terms of our life. I just see bad thinking everywhere I look here that is entrenched culturally in history, unfortunately.
So, Dr. Heiser, if one of your students came up to you and he was ranting about how the Jews have messed up the world, but then he went into they killed Stephen, they're killing Palestinian and Syrian Christians, they are destroying the moral fabric of America, how would you counter, or even you wouldn't waste your time?
Am I in a good mood or a bad mood when I encounter that?
But the question is, if most people say, well, I don't want to waste my time with a crazy guy, isn't there like a responsibility to kind of try to gear the person in the right way?
Yes, there is. There is. And this is why, I don't know if you're familiar with my Middle Earth analogy, but I am a scholar that does spend time in what I affectionately call Christian Middle Earth, where you have a lot of misguided thinking. It's not all equally bad or equally tortured exegesis, but there's a lot of goofy stuff. And I've spent the better part of 20, 25 years in that for that reason. Now, I don't spend all my time there because it would probably make me unhinged. It's just the kind of place that when I visit this sort of world of popular Christianity that gets fed off the internet. It's one of those do I laugh or cry kind of experiences. But I'm in there a lot because I do think scholars generally should serve the public interest, and in particular, this is destructive. When you see something destructive going on, yes, you have a moral obligation to try to disabuse this person as well as you can, of terrible thinking. And in this case, it's very obvious to see, where this can lead. So we should be doing that. But you're also correct. Most of the time, it just gets written off to the periphery. We got a bunch of crazy people out here, and I got better things to do, or I can only have an impact on one crazy person. What good is that going to do? Again, these are just excuses. I really do think that we should, again, be doing what we can in whatever place we're at, whatever our station is, to try to do something, and in my case, I have a YouTube channel. I mean, we try to bite into, again, the crazy topics. I do a little bit of podcasting about it. I do interviews on weird shows, like Coast to Coast AM and stuff like that. I've been doing that for 20, 25 years, and yes, I probably want to cry more than laugh. It's very frustrating, but I think we still need to at least take a shot at it, just try to do something useful here.
And the reason we're taking a shot at it right now is because going back to the example of there's a documentary where they have a white supremacist chaplain who prays with the men before they go and protest. And, we had the Charlottesville situation a year and a half ago, and then now there's people who are piggybacking on each other. Going back to the struggles with the Christendom as a theocratic kingdom, a lot of these shooters are saying that they're reclaiming the legacy of Christendom, and that they're the new crusaders, and that they're the new founders of.
Mm-hmm. All right. Let's revive and restore what this terrible idea of marrying the church and the state. Now, they don't put it that way. They think it's a great idea, but that's what they want. They want to marry their understanding of their faith, specifically to, in some cases, nationalism. In some cases, it's bigger than nationalism. It's more ethnic driven or whatever, racial theory, this and that. But at the bottom, the underlying all of this is, let's revive and restore a really crappy idea. An idea that specifically Jesus said, no, don't do that. That's where they're at. But and you ask, well, why do they do that? Are they just dumb? Well, I think in many respects, they don't look. If the leadership does look, they're fueling this because, they want power. Why does any group, I think this is a sort of a post-Babel, Tower of Babel impulse. This impulse for utopianism. When people forget, to have a utopia, what do you do with dissent? You have to crush it. Okay, but people want their vision of utopia so badly that they're willing, to have other people crushed, and they're going to demonize those other people that they don't like, that they know they're going to have to crush anyway. This gives me a reason to crush them. People, as Jeremiah said, the heart is deceitful and wicked. Above all things. This is the human condition. It's depravity. Again, it's what you'd call in the Hebrew Bible, it would be depravity. And one of the main sort of ways that depravity shows itself is a hunger and a lust for power over other people. And this is what they want. This is what drives the bus. A sense of superiority, a sense of wanting power over another group. Maybe there's a sense of desperation that there's so much in the world going on in the world that I don't like. I have to find some rationale, somebody to blame for it. And so, we'll pick this group or that group. But it's all in the name of justifying getting what they want and controlling and dominating other people. It's wicked. It is the very antithesis of Christ's model of a servant. And his model of servanthood was based on the Old Testament concept of imaging God. This is why you have the New Testament writers take the concept of imaging God and apply it to Jesus, about being a disciple of his and imaging him because he is the quote-unquote the perfect image of God. I mean, it all goes back to, to this kind of thinking. This is what Jesus wanted, to have the good character of God. But, that doesn't give you power. It led to Jesus, saying things like, turn the other cheek, and the meek shall inherit the earth. And, all this other, stuff that these white supremacists and others that want to use the New Testament, they skip that stuff just like they're skipping Jesus saying, let's keep the believing community, the church, and Caesar separate. It just doesn't serve their purpose.
In the book Jesus of Nazareth by Joseph Ratzinger, one of our last popes, he exonerates the Jews for the killing of Jesus and only blames the leaders of the first century Jewish community. That's interesting since it always goes back to we need a religious figure to say what makes sense, what is historically the case, that the Jewish people had nothing to do with the killing of Jesus. Christians would say that it was a crowd of Jewish people in the first century, or it was the religious leaders of that time. This blaming them for things that happened thousands of years ago is part of what is known as the mythical Jew conspiracy, where Jews are blamed for anything that ever happened. There's a thin line between religious bigotry and political bigotry, I believe, and let me tell you guys how this works. some people have a lot of problems with the Jewish community during ancient times, during this time, during modern times, and they like to disparage the Jewish leaders. And it includes not only Caiaphas and Annas, the two priests at the time of the trial of Jesus, but also the Talmudic rabbis, the Jewish sages who wrote the Talmud. In a radio show called The Bible Answer Man, someone called Hank Hanegraaff, a Christian apologist, to ask him about how he felt about the Israel-Palestine conflict. And he said, I am not pro-Israel, but I'm pro-justice. And in a lot of cases, people assume that Jews are not pro-justice because they support Israel, because they don't like what happened in the state of Israel. And that's where the anti-Semitic tropes come back to haunt the Jewish community. Another thing sometimes is brought up is that the Jewish community is willfully trying to undermine the teachings of Christ, and that they're trying to withhold the prophecies or the acceptance of Jesus from the people. I've written in response to this because it just seems very strange, but what I like to share is that Jews don't accept the claims of the New Testament mostly because of what is known in theological circles as theodicy, and that is the idea that there is suffering in the world. The concept of the Messiah in ancient times and even today has to do with the restoring of the idyllic place, either Eden or the theocratic kingdom in the Holy Land. So when they see that things are still in chaos, where there's war, there's famine and plagues and things like that, religious Jews feel that that was not changed, that Jesus lived and died and things are still pretty bad for everybody. So it's not specifically against Jesus, it's against the situation that we encounter as human beings. So just trying to dispel more myths that are brought up. And the one that I ran across this week, there's a passage that enemies of Jesus are being blamed for the blood of Abel, was the son of Adam and Eve that was killed by Cain. As we were talking about Jews being blamed for killing their prophets, there's a passage in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 11, verse 51, where Jesus says the following, quote, starts off at 50, quote, therefore this generation will be held responsible for the blood of all the prophets that has been shed since the beginning of the world. From the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who was killed between the altar and the sanctuary. Yes, I tell you, this generation will be held responsible for it all. And then he goes into a diatribe against the teachers of Torah at that time. And chapter 11:52, quote, woe to you experts in the law, because you have taken away the key to knowledge. You yourselves have not entered, and you have hindered those who were entering. And then when Jesus went outside, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law began to oppose him fiercely and to beseech him with questions, wanting to catch him in something he might say. So he was fighting with the Pharisees when this happened. He has woes against them. One of the experts of the law answered him, Teacher, when you say these things, you insult us also. Jesus replied, and you experts in the law, woe to you, because you load people down with burdens they can hardly carry, and you yourselves will not lift one finger to help them. Woe to you, because of you build tombs for the prophets, and it was your ancestors who killed them. So you testify that you approve what your ancestors did. They killed the prophets, and you build their tombs. Because of this, God in his wisdom said, I will send them prophets and apostles, some whom they will kill, and others they will persecute. And that quote is from... There's nowhere to be found in the Bible. So the difference between Jews and Christians is that Jews see Israel, the Jewish people, as sacrosanct. And sacrosanct is a fancy word for holy or hallowed, respected, unimpeachable, unchangeable, invulnerable, untouchable, inalienable, too special, too important or valuable to be interfered with. So that's really the difference. If something's sacrosanct, you try to think of it in a positive light. If something is not sacrosanct, you can insult it and talk trash all day long. So Christians see the church as sacrosanct. The Jewish people see the Jewish people as sacrosanct. It's a never-ending battle. Before we run out of time, there's a few Bible passages from the New Testament that I want to discuss. So it seems like in the manifesto he's alluding to John 16:2, and when Jesus says that you'll be kicked out of the synagogues. I think he says that in Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount as well. And this guy or other people take that to mean that the Jews are persecuting Christians nowadays. That's a completely There's people who even wonder if that was truly happening in the time of Jesus, or is it something that happened later and then it was reworked into the words of Jesus to pinpoint at the division between different Jewish groups. But how can someone within the context understand this form of persecution and not take it like personal?
Well, the very next verse, okay, John 16:2, they will put you out of the synagogues. Indeed, the hour is coming when whoever kills you will think he's offering service to God. Verse 3, and they will do these things because they have not known the Father, nor me. So if you're a Christian and you want to be like Christ, and you want to be like the Father, the God of Israel, the God of the Jew, and the God of the Christian, you don't do these things. It's very plain. It's not a conundrum. Again, it's kind of a good. Let's just lift verse 2 out of that, and then run roughshod over it. And this is the way it's typically done. Again, we shouldn't be surprised with this. This is the way it's typically done. But the way I would, again, if I have somebody quote this, to me, I'm going to say, hey, can we throw verse 3 in there? Because this is what you're not supposed to do. So let's try not to just rape the text. But again, that's probably if I'm in a cranky mood, I would say rape the text. But again, I run into so much of this stuff that it's, I'm with you. It's disturbing. It's all too frequent. It's not like every time I hop on the web I see this stuff, but it's all too frequent. And it's a shame that people are so biblically illiterate. That this is what it's come to, this sort of proof texting. And historically, Christians did persecute Jews. Jews persecuted Christians. Jews persecuted Jews. Christians persecuted other Christians. I mean, everybody's persecuting some, either the outsider, the rival, or even there are people in their own group. And again, it all goes back to how does this image God? How does this, create the kind of community that it should be really clear that God wanted it even as far back as Eden. Okay, how does it create this thing that God, prompted God's original desire to even create humanity? How does it do that? But see, that's a big picture question. That's an upper level, question that unfortunately too many people don't ask these sorts of things. They don't, look for the wider biblical theological context. Again, what we would call the meta narrative of Scripture. They don't bother with that. There's this thought I want to think. There's this person I hate. There's this belief I want to have, and by golly, I got my Bible verse for it, so don't bother me. That's just the situation we're in.
Okay, so then we go to, this is one that I found, and I find it super abuse of the text, so you tell me if I'm wrong. So in Romans 11:28, most translation, it says, for as regard of the gospel, they're enemies on account of you, but as regards of election, beloved on account of the patriarchs. This is speaking of Jews who don't believe in Jesus. But in the Oxford translation, as well as in a couple of other ones, it says they're not enemies of the gospel. It says they're enemies of God. And I asked one of my
I've never heard of the Oxford translation. What is that?
People from Oxford, like it's the one that scholars use.
Well, I'm a scholar and I've never heard of it.
So New Oxford.
I've never heard of it.
But there's quite a few that do the same. The New Oxford Annotated Bible, it comes with the Apocrypha.
What's annotated in it?
It has their, whatever scholars they have, their little summaries of each chapter. But looking at it in the Bible Hub, it even says, Good News Translation, because they rejected the good news, the Jews are God's enemies for the sake of you Gentiles. So it doesn't say that in the Greek, and they throw it in as an afterthought. That's the Good News Translation.
The good.
It's in the Contemporary English version. It's
Yeah, I want to look at the good news here.
and quite a few of them. And for me, it's like, do they really have to like bring it home and just go all the way to add to the text? It's not in the Greek, and to me, those are the errors or because anti-Semitism is not based on reality. It's based on preconceived notions and reading into stuff. So for someone to take in a Christian perspective, it could even be like a beautiful passage that says, they're beloved by God, and one day they'll see the light or something like that. To suddenly be like, oh no, by the way, they're all condemned, they're all enemies of God. It's like, it doesn't say that, but let's
read it again in the Good News translation, just so I can hear it again.
Because they rejected the good news, the Jews are God's enemies for the sake of you Gentiles.
Is that the end of the verse?
And then it goes to the next one. But because of God's choice, they are his friends because of their ancestors. So they're enemies, but they're also friends. They're frenemies. And but the Oxford one pretty much leaves it at the Weymouth New Testament. In relation to the good news, the Jews are God's enemies for your sakes. But in relation to God's choice, they're dearly beloved for the sake of their forefathers. At the end, it kind of softens, but if you just focus on they're God's enemies, it's not even in the text. So they're creating their own theology within the text.
Yeah, they are. What's really, I mean, you're right. The God's enemies thing. It's not in the text, but even their translation. Here's why I wanted you to read it again. As far as God's choice, you could say, well, choice is the same as election, but it really, I mean, the term there is election, and that is a loaded term with the Old Testament. I mean, that there's a special relationship between God and Israel, and this whole concept of election. So even the Good News translation taking that out, or using some sort of more neutral word, that hurts too. It takes away any sense of God's relationship, to his people in the Old Testament. So this is a good mini commercial for not using the Good News translation. Yeah, that's pretty egregious. It really is. And for your listeners, don't get too discouraged with this. I mean, on the one hand, yes, there are no perfect translations, but this is a good exercise. I always recommend, because I get this question a lot, what translation should I use? And after I sort of joke and say, well, the best translation is the one you'll actually read. I know that that's not actually true. So I always recommend read from more than one. Because if you get a substantive disagreement, like you've pointed out here, between the GNT and something else, that is an important thing to notice. And that's a place to drill down in your own personal study. And you'll find out, as you said, where are they getting this God's enemies thing? Because God's not in the text there. I mean, this is a good exercise, to be able to do this. But I'm sorry again to tell your audience, like I'm sorry to tell other audiences, tongue in cheek here. But when it comes to Bible study, you have to remember a 4-letter word, and that is work. Okay? It takes some work. It takes some commitment, to ferret things like this out. But a good first step is look at things in more than one translation, and you'll spot these things. Now, I don't know, who translated this. A lot of these committee translations, I know, like the New American Standard was famous for like having their translators' names not published, like it was a big secret, and that's kind of unique. Most other translations are fine with that. So I don't know if the person who translated this was, some sort of, closet anti-Semite or I mean, who knows? But I could say that's pretty careless. Somebody took your translation and now look what they can do with it. That was careless.
So I heard one time, and the reason we started the discussion is because I wanted to talk about the passage where it says that it's Revelation 2:9. I know your tribulation and poverty, but rich you are, and the slander of those claiming Jews to be themselves. This is interlinear, so that's why this sound properly, and are not, but a synagogue of Satan. And I heard one time that somebody who was criticizing the New Testament was saying, it's interesting that in this passage, the word for Bet Knesset or Kehillah for a place of gathering of Jews is used as a synagogue. It's a synagogue in the Greek and it's a synagogue in the English translation, but there are other parts in the New Testament where the term synagogue is used for a congregation of Jewish Christians or God-fearers, and they don't use the term synagogue. They use church or they use something else. But when it comes down to synagogue of Satan, they purposely leave it there. Have you heard of that? And is that also an abuse of the text?
Well, it is an abuse, and you just pointed out one reason it is. There is no clear demarcation of the term, synagogue as only being coupled with the term Satan. You have synagogues being referred to just generically elsewhere with, they're not bad. They have nothing to do with Satan. They're synagogues. They're gatherings. And you could have more than one word again describe that community. But someone trying to make an argument that synagogue, these are the only place it occurs is Revelation 2:9 and Revelation 3:9. It's associated with Satan. Okay, that's what you'd have to argue, which is just bunk. I mean, all you need is a concordance to overturn that. So, yeah, I mean that's an abuse of the text. I'll tell you what else is an abuse of the text. Is in that verse, the reference to Jews is actually positive. The Jews are being, Judaios there in Greek is actually being contrasted, with this synagogue of Satan. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the whole point of what, the writer's saying is that, the term Jews there is positive. The writer wants the people in this particular synagogue to be in this other category. He wants them to be Jews. They say they're Jews, but they're not. They're over here in the synagogue. He wants them to be in the category called Jews. He's approving of that category. Now, that takes us into, well, who are the Jews that John is talking about? And, there are actually 4 or 5 options for this. This term, was used in the early centuries for a person born a Jew, just an ethnic thing. It's used of pagans who convert to Judaism, whether they're an official proselyte or not. They were called Jews. It's just somebody from Judea, whether they were ethnically, from one of the tribes of Israel or not. They get called Jews. I think it's fair to say, because, we're in the New Testament here, is John wants these people, to be, what like he is. John is a Jew. He wants them to believe, in Jesus as the Messiah, to be, a Jew that's a real Jew, circumcised to the heart, that kind of thing. The New Testament writers are not running around, saying that, all Jews are awful people and, all this kind of stuff. They want them to, sort of be in the same category with them, accepting their Messiah, because the New Testament writers believe Jesus is the Messiah. The other thing that makes this an abuse is that, hey, Jesus called Peter Satan. Get behind me, Satan. Does that mean Jesus was anti-apostolic? He was anti-Peter? No. The term itself just means you're on the side of the opposition. It's a loaded term for us because of the way it gets used in other passages, but Jesus calls Peter that directly. And it's very clear, in the gospel stories that Jesus still loves Peter, and he, even after Peter betrays him, he comes to Peter and befriends him and redeems him. He loves Peter. He's not anti-Peter. He's not anti-apostolic. He says you're in the opposition here, and that was a term that they could use to denote the opposition. But if you're, somebody can easily take this and say, the Jews are all satanic, and then make this lame synagogue argument that like this is the way the term is used when it's not. Like, who's going to check? People do think that, like, who's going to check? I'm just going to say it because I'm going to say it because I need to say it. I want to say it. I like the way it sounds, or maybe they're parroting something else. The Christian and the New Testament writers here is what I'm thinking of specifically. Yeah, they can be mad when they're persecuted. Sure, they can. But they're going to view the Jews as the loyal opposition. These are the people of God. We want them to be, to be Jews of the circumcised heart, to believe, in the Messiah. Paul, my heart's desire, is that Israel, my people, would come to the Lord. I mean, this isn't hatred. It's a disagreement of opinion, to be sure. But, it's not anti-Semitism. The problem in our culture is we take, and this is going to get worse. We're descending into sort of a paganized tribal culture, but just a bunch of tribes, where any disagreement is parsed as hate. I'm old enough to remember that that's just absurd. You grow up, you disagree with people in your own family. Does that mean you hate them? Disagree with your neighbor over it. It doesn't. These two things are not completely overlapping synonymous ideas, but they're treated as though they are. So again, I don't want to just ramble on here, but I don't think we have any reason, first of all, and I think we're without excuse if we start to cherry pick the New Testament as a justification for hating someone. That's just unchristian. It's unchristlike. You can get mad at somebody. Yep, I understand that. We're all human. We're going to have disagreements. But at the end of the day, you're not supposed to hate people. You're not supposed to seek their demise. In both Testaments, Hebrew Bible, New Testament, that is a mark of ungodliness. And just it's wicked. I don't know what else to call it. And I'll throw this into. I think it's a really bad idea for Christians to have a negative, and I'm even going a little bit beyond the anti-Semitism here. I think it's a really bad idea for Christians generally to have a negative view of we'll just say Jews here, just to isolate them specifically. Because, newsflash, the culture is becoming more pagan all the time. We're actually going to need each other. Christians who are serious about living out real Christianity, we're going to need, Jews, and they're going to need us. Again, because we're going to be the ones who are still God-fearing in our culture, in an increasingly pagan tribal culture that wants nothing to do with either of us. So I think it's a really bad idea, again, to fragment ourselves, even within the Christian community. We see so much fragmentation. This is a really bad idea with the culture trending the way it is. I think we need to do more things intentionally so that we see that we're all in this together. Again, we're the God-fearers here. We need to stick together, and just be in each other's corner, because we're going to need that. We're just going to need it, and it's the right thing to do.
Well, I appreciate you taking a stand, because one thing that is disheartening is that whenever you bring up what happened during the Holocaust, where many Christians did not speak out because of fear or because they were too entangled with the government, everybody always brings up Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and what nobody will tell you is that was one guy out of thousands. So if people can be, if we had more of him, then we could keep this cyclical thing that is happening again, where people are being scapegoated, they're being lied about, slandered, and there's like this you were talking about what makes supremacists do what they do is that they've been pinned against other groups. They have their own issues and their own struggles, and instead of dealing with those struggles, they're blaming it on someone else and building up that hatred. So I appreciate you coming on my show and having this discussion and bringing some clarity to things that can be distorted, abused, or completely falsified to push an agenda that, as you say, is not consistent with the teachings of the founder of Christianity and this faith that is very powerful and it has a lot of influence in the world. And we hear the Pope and other people talk about little issues, but we would like for leaders within your community to take strong stands regarding issues like this one. So we appreciate you doing that for us.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on.
And so keep up your good work, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right, thank you.
I also wanted to respond to the lack of information regarding the subject of, is the New Testament anti-Semitic? Because by bringing up the New Testament passages, then it really builds a case against the New Testament, and something that is accused by some people of being. No credible scholar thinks the New Testament is anti-Semitic. Instead, they would say that it is anti-Jewish. The problem with that is that Judaism as an institution wasn't established to that point. There was many Judaisms at the time of Jesus. And so it's more of a sectarian, antagonistic, historical narrative. In being sectarian, it disparages other religious groups that don't agree with them. Many people try to defend the New Testament by claiming that the Hebrew Bible is antagonistic against the Jewish people for the rebellion or whatever they see, but that's a poorly developed argument because it supports a biased reading of the Bible. The Israelite prophets were harsh towards the apostate members of their community, not just like Jesus, but as integral part of the leadership system of that time. Jesus is usually shown as like an outsider, even though he's from Galilee and Judea. He comes in to random towns and busting people's heads, per se, and he fights against his detractors. Most people who are very sensitive about this because of the persecution that has happened from it, they would say that that his words condemn all Jews, and there is no division between the Jews of that time, the specific religious groups, and people now, because that's how it's been interpreted. So the theology of anti-Semitism is one of racial or ethnic prejudice, but religious anti-Semitism is the idea that Jews are incapable of redemption due to their sinful nature, something medieval Catholics and some Protestants at the time of the Nazis believed. Even when Jews became Christian, they needed to be destroyed because they were inherently evil. So in the German Protestants, very few people lifted a finger to intervene with the Nazi propaganda and agenda. And they had watered down the Bible so much, the theologians before that, that it became an integral part of Christianity to hate Judaism and to see Jesus not as a Jew, but as a Galilean Aryan somehow. So the literal interpretation of the Bible is based on the eyes of the beholder, because people can emphasize one part or the others. There's an anti-Semitic provocateur in Austin named Texie Mars who says a lot of the same verbiage as the individual we're talking about. And what he says is that he attributes also the death of the prophets to all Jews, and he infuses some of the conflictive soliloquies of Jesus to modern day people. So that goes back to how the Bible can be dangerous in the wrong hands by people who are purposely manipulating it to condemn and to disparage some people. So again, this is a very heavy subject. We've been talking about it for 2 shows. We're gonna move on to a different subject next time. But I just wanted to close the show thanking you for your patience to go through all these very disturbing ideas, and for us to keep working through, like Dr. Heiser would say, these things, and to act like they don't exist creates more problems than to actually take them head on. So again, thank you for listening to The Mystic and the Skeptic. If you have any questions, please email me at mysticandskeptic, all one word, @gmail.com. You can also go to our Facebook page or our WordPress website for more information. And the WordPress website is mysticandskeptic.wordpress.com. Thank you for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of The Mystic and the Skeptic. 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 And the Skeptic.